talking about one of the most famous tax collectors in the Bible. We're going to be looking at the story of Zacchaeus, and this is in Luke chapter 19. If you have your Bibles with you, I encourage you to open them up to Luke chapter 19, and we're just going to read the whole passage. This is going to be from verse 1 to verse 10. So we're in Luke chapter 19, verse 1 to verse 10. And the passage we're about to read is happening towards the end of Jesus' ministry. The passage is going to begin by telling us that Jesus was passing through. You see, Jesus is actually on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way to his final week. So the things that Jesus is going to do on this final trip to Jerusalem are really setting the tone for what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, for what the communities of Jesus are supposed to look like. What are their priorities? What are their focus? So let's read together. This will be Luke chapter 19, verse 1 to 10. It says this: Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed the Sycamore Fig Tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." I think that everyone loves a good villain. You might not want to admit this, but whenever you're listening to a story or maybe watching a film, if you see a good villain, it's maybe a little bit exciting. You know, for better or for worse, sometimes Hollywood seems to create some of the best villains. By the way, the best villains are actually found in the Bible. But we have some famous examples from Hollywood. There's this very famous character. It's estimated that 50% of living adults in the world are aware of this villain. His name is Darth Vader. All you have to do is show an image and people instantly recognize, and they say, "That's a villain." There's a Christian theologian, his name is Jones, and he says whenever a Christian becomes aware of something from the media or something from films, Hollywood, whatever you have, he says a Christian should ask 2 questions. We're looking if we can learn anything from something like Darth Vader, right? He says you should ask 2 questions. He says a first question you should ask is, what lie is this movie trying to tell me? That's important to remember, because sometimes even the most harmless looking movies with the message of believe in yourself, we can agree, oh, that's a very positive message, but it actually, believing in ourselves, independence, taking our focus away from God, all these things appear to be good, but they're actually negative, right? So first question is, what lie is this movie trying to tell us? So when we look at this villain, there are many lies that this movie's trying to tell us. But the second thing, and this is what I find interesting, Jones says, what truth is this movie trying to tell us in spite of itself? So somewhere along the line, there's an appeal that's happening to half of living adults about this one villain. Is there a commonality? Is there a truth that's going on? And what you find out actually is when you're looking at a villain like Darth Vader. By the way, this is not a recommendation or anything like that. All right, just It's just something to be aware of, right? He says, one of the things that you find almost universally with all the villains, beginning, with this very famous one, is they all seem to have something broken with them, both physically and psychologically. In the example of Darth, he's been injured throughout his life to the point where he's mostly robotic at this point. And that's how you can recognize he's a villain. And J.J. Abrams, the guy who actually helped with the latest films, he talks about it, and he says it's important that this villain have brokenness on the outside to represent their inner turmoil. So where are we going with this? Why are we talking about this villain? It actually goes a little further. As a society, we seem to have, from the very beginning, we seem to have very clear categories of what's supposed to look righteous and good, and what is supposed to look evil and villainous. Some of these categories are helpful, but sometimes they're not at all. From children's literature, there's been studies done, and by the age of 8, a child with one glimpse can tell whether someone is good or evil, and it has nothing to do with actually getting to know the person. From children's literature, if you are good looking, right? If you are attractive, sometimes if you are from a certain ethnic persuasion, you're already judged as being good. However, if you look different, if you maybe have a crooked nose, if you maybe have a limp, from an early age, from children's literature, you are taught to recognize that that's evil, that that's villainous. And psychologists talk about this. They say that if you happen to be good looking, by the way, I know there's, if you've been blessed with good lookingness, good for you. Thank God for your gifts and use them for his glory. But if you are a good looking person, did you know that you will probably make more money? That strangers will be more likely to help you? You will be promoted more, given more opportunities, and the list goes on and on. However, if you are not attractive, if you are challenged in the handsome or beautiful department, as some of us are, okay, let's just be real here, life will be that much more difficult for you. It's some of these things that we know intuitively, right? But let's bring it all together. What we're talking about is there is an archetype for a villain, for a bad person, okay? You would be hard pressed to find a villain anywhere on TV, movies, or books, or even in the scriptures, who does not have a scar, a limp, or some kind of a disability. And psychologists talk about this and say, whenever we can see someone with a scar, whenever we see someone who has a grotesque feature or something so different about them that makes them not normal, we can therefore see them as the other. And you can think about it. Most villains that you've seen will either have some kind of a hook, will either have maybe an eye patch, will either have something else going on, or will have some kind of disfigurement. And even in 2022, the belief is still strong and alive that your physical appearance somehow accurately reflects your inner life. And so we can judge in an instant. But there's a little bit more. Psychologists have studied people that grow up with disabilities, with both physical disabilities and social disabilities. And what ends up happening is, as a child grows up looking different, or as an adult, who's encountered a life-changing disability, they then transition to the rest of their lives. They found out that you begin developing coping strategies from the perceived whether real or not, rejection that you will get from others. And these coping strategies are different for everyone, right? Some people will cope with power. Some people will cope by isolating themselves, by shutting themselves off from the world. So there's all manners of coping strategies. So the reason we're talking about this is because the study of a social disability, the study of being a villain, will be key in looking at Luke chapter 19. But there's one more aspect of a villain, of what makes a good villain. And by saying a good villain, I mean a bad villain. It's this. As a society, as people, I think we all carry an internal metric of when we think that someone can be redeemed. A good villain has crossed the line so many times that they are beyond redemption. And sometimes we have that internal metric about others, That person, they can come to church, right? That person, yes, they can come to church, have to have a couple of changes. Oh, but that person over there, they've been doing this for years. They've been giving so many opportunities. They are beyond redemption. What's else is we apply that metric to ourselves. If only you knew the kind of life that I lived, you wouldn't want me in your church, right? If you only knew what I'm struggling with right now, you wouldn't want me in your church. So we carry these internal metrics of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and that makes for a very good villain, the one that's crossed the line, that is beyond redemption, which, by the way, that world-famous villain, fictitious villain, Darth Vader, crosses all those boxes, having crossed the line over and over again, a villain without redemption. So we're back to Luke chapter 19. We're going to be looking at our villain. His name is Zacchaeus. He is the chief tax collector. Okay? That means that he's in charge of all the tax collectors in the region. You know what that means? That means that no one likes Zacchaeus, not even other tax collectors. You see, it was a practice of a tax collector to collect taxes, right? It's in the name. However, there's no salary involved. What you have to do is you have to charge a little extra to pay for yourself. And of course you can do that because you have the backing of the Roman Empire. And now take it a little further. When you become the boss of tax collectors, you now have the backing of the Roman Empire to steal from those who are stealing. So we have a story of a very unique individual who is hated across the board by absolutely everyone. No one wants to hang out with him. There is not one real relationship in his life. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is not that his job is that he's a tax collector, that he's a thief, that he seems to be heartless. The worst part, according to his neighborhood, is that he is a traitor to his own people and is a collaborator with the occupying armies of Rome. But here's what we have to imagine about Zacchaeus. You have to know that no kid in Israel at that time grew up thinking to themselves, I'm going to be a tax collector when I grow up. Not a single one of them thought, oh, hey, when I grow up, I want no one to like me. Oh, when I grow up, I want to eat every single meal by myself. No one ever thought that. So we can imagine with Zacchaeus' life is that something about him started him on this long, slow journey of making incremental choices that took him further and further away from who he was meant to be. And then at the time that Jesus shows up, at the time of Luke 19, we find a guy who has taken way too many steps, who according to everyone around him is considered to be a sinner beyond redemption. That's the situation where we find him. But there's a crucial detail in understanding the Zacchaeus story. How does he take this long journey? Why is he in the situation that he is? There's one crucial detail that really helps us understand this. And this is in verse 3. This is Luke chapter 19, verse 3. And it says this: "But being a short man, he could not see because of the crowd." This, by the way, is a key detail. You hear the kids sing about it, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, right? It's a key detail to understanding the whole story. And you can speak to some commentators, you can read some commentators, and they will spiritualize this detail. They'll say, when we say that Zacchaeus was a short man, it means that his spirituality was short. His spirituality was small. That's not quite accurate. They are correct. His spirituality was short. It was very small. But the person who's writing this book, his name is Luke, and we know that Luke is a doctor. Whenever Luke talks about a physical characteristic of one of his characters, of one of the people he's observing, it's on purpose, it's intentional, and it's very detailed. Most importantly, though, whenever Luke mentions a physical characteristic, it's critical to understand this characteristic in order to understand the narrative, to understand the story. You don't have to look very far to see that Luke in chapter 13, he'll talk about the bent over woman and how Jesus heals her. Goes into great detail what her condition is. You can't understand her story until you understand her condition. The man who was lame from birth, who used to sit at the beautiful gate that we have in Acts, again, it's Luke who goes into great detail. You don't understand the story unless you know his condition. Acts chapter 8, you have the Ethiopian eunuch. You have two physical descriptors, and both are necessary to understand the fact of what this Ethiopian eunuch was going up against, his own journey. So you see, whenever Luke is going to mention something, it is very important to understand through their disability. So how is Zacchaeus described? What we have in Luke chapter 19, he uses the word helikia mikros, which means being short of stature. Helikia mikros, that's the Greek word. And what we find is that word mikros at that time was used to describe pathological dwarfism. They actually used that word to describe pathological dwarfism all the way to the 4th century BCE. AD. So in other words, Zacchaeus was what today we would call a little person. His condition would have been instantly obvious. And the other thing that we have is people at that time, there is a lot of evidence, and we see this evidence, by the way, in how people viewed sin and viewed sin as God's punishment to them. Physical deformities, physical characteristics were God's punishment because of their sin. So you have to understand that from the beginning, Zacchaeus appeared to be rejected because of his condition. That is the situation that we have, which, by the way, nowadays, according to the Little People Association, they don't consider it a physical disability. They consider it more of a social disability. But there's more going on. There's more going on. In Leviticus 21, it mentions a list of those who are not welcome in the congregation, which, by the way, at that time, it seems that the leaders had taken even steps further, not only to welcome them in the temple, but not to welcome them in association at all. And one of the things that is listed, and we have it here in verse 20, a hunchback or a dwarf or a man with a defect in his eye or a eunuch, and the list goes on. But, it actually tells us at the end of 22, they may, however, eat the bread of their God, both the most holy and the holy. So you see, the intention of God is, in the end, they should have fellowship and community, but at the time of Zacchaeus, it stopped. It just said, if you're a dwarf, if you're a little person, you are cut off from God. So what do we have with Zacchaeus? We have Zacchaeus was a person who was instantly recognized as someone who wasn't favored by God. In fact, maybe cursed by God, right? Someone who was a social outcast simply by their physical appearance, by the religious system. He wasn't even allowed to participate. So when we sing that song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. In other words, that was almost a death sentence. What's even more, though, is, as psychologists tell us about this, is when someone judges you and perceives you before they've even gotten to know you, it becomes a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If people think I am a villain, right? If from an instant they can recognize me as a villain, well, then you start heading down that path. Sometimes that happens in our situation, right? Maybe people only knew you in high school and they knew what kind of person you are. And when they see you, they go, oh, it's them. It's that person. I know what they're about. How discouraging is that, right? I think actually that's how most people meet at camp meeting, right? You meet someone who said, hey, I know your parents. You are the son, the daughter of so-and-so, you know? Your whole identity is based on your family and your parents, whether for better or for worse. And what's more is, as Zacchaeus is on this self-fulfilling prophecy, we talked about it before, he begins to compensate for his brokenness, for his wound. How does Zacchaeus protect himself? How does Zacchaeus end up making sense of the world? How does Zacchaeus, by the way, develop such ambition then in a ruthless, cutthroat world of tax collectors, in dealing with the enemy, the Roman Empire, in dealing with religious leaders, mixing all this? How does Zacchaeus come through? What kinds of things is he compensating? How deep is that wound that he's carrying? He compensates with money and power. Money and power. And it helps him grow. By the way, sometimes it's helpful to ask the question, am I compensating for something? Is there something right now that I am pursuing? Maybe it's the approval of others to mask some brokenness inside of me, something hollow. Maybe it's you have to be a tough guy. You have to be a tough woman. So you have to act a certain way. Maybe it's you're going to be a hard worker no matter what, or else people will think I'm lazy. It could be something so minor, but we have to keep asking ourselves that question. Is there anything that I'm compensating? By the way, the Bible gives us another name. It calls it idolatry. It's anything that we place higher than the approval of God. So Zacchaeus, his idol is money and power. So far, it seems to fulfill his needs, except that it isn't. It's left him bankrupt. It's left him heartbroken. It leaves him alone, and the story's going to tell us that he can no longer live in that situation. He is getting so desperate, he's going to make some big, bold moves, some big leaps to see Jesus. But ultimately, we have the story of the perfect villain. From a distance, people can tell that something is wrong with him. He's part of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now he's crossed so many lines. There have been families that have been thrown out of their homes. Men and women thrown in jail because of his command. He is beyond redemption. If you can imagine that. He is beyond any concept of redemption. The perfect villain. He is an outcast to his own people. He doesn't belong anywhere. No one will talk to him. No one will eat with him. His life is set in one direction. However, a rumor comes through because those tax collectors, they actually communicate very well. You know, you don't want to lose a single cent in paying to Rome. And the communication that comes through, probably from Levi, who was a tax collector, right? That in Luke chapter 5, that Jesus reached out to. It probably comes through that there is a teacher who has a soft spot for tax collectors. Wow. A teacher a soft spot for tax collectors, the irredeemable, and he's coming this way? Yes, yes. And here's the thing about a rumor. If you're desperate enough, almost anything will give you hope. And so when he hears that Jesus is coming his way, the Bible tells us that this grown man, this dignified, very powerful individual, climbs a sycamore fig tree. Adult men don't climb trees. That's just common knowledge back then. They did that was a thing of children. And yet there he is. He's not going to let anything get in his way. He climbs a sycamore fig tree. By the way, a sycamore fig tree has a short trunk, so he can get climbing on branches pretty quickly. The branches are long and spreading. The tree can grow up to 40 feet high. And Zacchaeus picks his moment, and he climbs the tree, and he goes all the way up. By the way, there's lots of trees in this area, but he happens to pick a sycamore fig tree. We'll talk about that later. And as he goes up, he gets himself on a tree, and luckily he's out of the way. No one's noticing, because Zacchaeus, all he wants to do, according to verse 3, is he wants to see Jesus. And we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean that he wants to see Jesus? What does that mean? It means that he would have been satisfied to simply catch a glimpse of Jesus. It would have been more than enough for him to know that there was someone out there who existed who had a soft spot for tax collectors. That would have been enough. And I want you to know that there are some of you here today or watching online that are here to simply catch a glimpse of Jesus. That maybe you've heard a rumor that Jesus loves sinners, that Jesus loves broken people, and you just want to catch a glimpse of that. But know this, Jesus always overwhelms our expectations. And instead of catching just a glimpse of Jesus, Jesus stops the whole procession, stops the whole thing, and he says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house. Did you hear that must? Jesus has no choice. It means that is who Jesus is. It means that Jesus' mission was to reach out to people like Zacchaeus. By extension, by the way, that means that the mission of the church is to reach out to people like Zacchaeus. It means that the collection of the people that go to church are people like Zacchaeus, sincere seekers. Check it out. John 3:17 says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." That was the mission of Jesus from the beginning. And as Jesus and Zacchaeus are eating, people begin murmuring. Some versions say they began muttering. Some other versions say they began complaining. How dare he sit down and eat with a sinner? You see, eating with someone was a universal sign of friendship in that culture. How could he be doing this with a sinner? Does Jesus not know that they commit sin in that home? By the way, the story tells us Zacchaeus throws a party. And here's the question. What kind of party do you think a tax collector throws? What kind of ambiance, what kind of environment do you think happens when all the tax collectors in the region are brought in? Who have been outcasts, who are considered world-class sinners. I want you to know that maybe you and I would not have been comfortable in that environment. In fact, Jesus is later accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. Now, there's a difference between mission and going to a party. Well, we won't get into that for now, but you can imagine that this would have been a little awkward for the disciples as they follow Jesus. Oh man, Jesus is doing it again. We're in one of these environments again. Why does he keep doing this? Because his mission was to seek and save the lost, right? The hospital is for the sick, not the perfect. You see, at that time, the religious movement had been so concerned with keeping themselves pure and holy, which, by the way, there was good reason for that. You see, if we read Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, we see the story that's being told that the children of Israel are sent into captivity, Judah sent into captivity because they intermixed with the nations around them. They let cultures and ideas come and mix with them, and they lost their unique calling. So when they come back, right, when they come back to the land, strict rules and boundaries go up so that we will never again be like the nations. By the way, those are good intentions, right? We have to stay faithful to the mission that God has with us. But somehow along the way, they miss the point. Holiness is not the goal. Holiness will happen. Sinning less is not the goal. The goal for them of being God's special people was to love more. And by extension, the goal of the followers of Jesus is not just to be different, not to do bad things. The goal is always to love more passionately, to reach out more. And you know what happens at this dinner party? There is a transformation. And you know what, that earlier villain, that very famous villain, Darth Vader, the reason apparently that he sticks so well in pop culture today is that towards the end of his life, he is redeemed. And there's something in the ethos here, in the belief that if a villain can be redeemed, if a villain can turn their life around, an obvious villain who's gone too far, what if there's hope for me? By the way, this is gospel without gospel, right? And what we have here in the story of Zacchaeus is we have an example of a villain beyond redemption who is redeemed. And here's how it happens. Did you know that Jesus never condemns him? Jesus, living up to his mission, doesn't condemn him. As far as we know, Jesus doesn't even preach to him. All that Jesus offers is friendship, love, and grace. Imagine that. Friendship, love, and grace. While the general religious system is offering condemnation, rejection, keeping a list of rights and wrongs, Jesus, on the other hand, he's offering friendship, love, and grace. And without any prompting, Zacchaeus stands up and says, "Look, Lord, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." We have in Exodus 22 and 2 Samuel 12 verse 6, we have the protocols on what to do if you need to pay back something that you've stolen. And you're supposed to pay back the original amount plus 20%. Not so in Zacchaeus' case. Zacchaeus is going to pay back the original amount and then pay back 4 times. You know that if Zacchaeus follows through with his promise, with his vow, he's going to be broke. He's going to have no more money. It's over for him. But this is also this bold statement that he's making. He's in essence saying, money has been my master. I've been compensating for so long. I've been afraid of who I am for so long. I've been making money this idol, power my idol, that I can no longer be part of this at all. And he gives it all away. You see, for Zacchaeus, money and power, that's something he can no longer touch. By the way, each one of us, sometimes there will be things that as a follower of Jesus, you can't even touch. Some can do in moderation, some can go incrementally, but you cannot touch. In Zacchaeus' case, it's money and power. And as far as we know, he gives it all away. And the way that he gives it is interesting. He gives it in a public scenario with public affirmation. You know what this is called? It's called radical accountability. Anybody in that room could say, "Hey, you made that promise to the master." He would say, "Yes, I did." Which, by the way, is what is so powerful about the church coming together, where we can publicly affirm each other and our choices and our commitments to follow Jesus. But there's another story here. There's another tree that we have in the scriptures. This tree's found in Matthew 21 and Mark 11. There was another sycamore fig tree, Jesus ran into this tree. It had been a long day. It had been a long day of walking. The disciples were hungry. Jesus was hungry. They arrived at a perfect looking fig tree. There were leaves on the outside. It looked fully bloomed. And when Jesus reached in, he couldn't find a single tree, a single fig, not a single fruit. You see, in that environment, the fig tree was considered to be Israel. It was a symbol of what Israel was. Israel was in the royal seals. It was a fig tree. When you saw a fig tree, you would think, oh, the nation of Israel. That would be your first response. Kind of like when you see a maple leaf with Canadians, you think Canada or maybe a beaver, right? And so this perfect looking tree represents the nation of Israel. It represented the religious system of that time. It looked perfect on the outside. It looked like their guidelines, right, of holiness, of strict judgment. They were supposed to produce fruit, and yet they didn't. It was as though you're walking into a perfect church where everything is efficient, on time, perfect in every way, and yet is there fruit there? What does fruit look like? And in the story of Zacchaeus, it's another fig tree. Do you know that? The sycamore fig tree. This fig tree, however, is not perfect. No. This fig tree has different kind of fruit on it. In fact, it's a fruit that no one even sees. Not a single person in the crowd can see the fruit on this tree. Only Jesus can. And Jesus can recognize this fruit as a sincere follower and seeker of God. And this fruit that everyone thinks is irredeemable, that shouldn't belong on a perfect tree, is the one that Jesus calls forth to follow him. So here's the question I want to leave with you guys today. Here's the question I want to leave with us. What kind of tree should the communities of Jesus be? What kind of tree should the Red Deer Seventh-day Adventist Church be? One that looks perfect on the outside, where behavior matters more, but that ultimately has no fruit? Or one that is imperfect, one that offers friendship and grace? What kind of tree is God calling us to be? And if this is your first time in church today, and the Holy Spirit is calling you forward, is moving on your heart right now, I want you to know that you are not beyond redemption. That the fact that you're here, that you're listening, means that God is speaking to you. And that God can indeed transform. That God can indeed restore. And just let me leave you with some encouragement. As the story ends, it says, Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Today is a special day for you, because today salvation has come to your house. God bless.